periods, and PCO on ultrasound, and you have to have 2 of those 3, and I had all 3. And I remember when I then saw the consultant with the bloods, and again that showed, there's another one where it's a balance of your FSH and LH, which are supposed to be around the same, but if you have LH that's like through the roof, then that often is a sign of PCOS, although it's not on the diagnostic criteria. Because I was very, I was skinny, and he said, it's a misconception. So after the bloods all came back, you got an appointment with the consultant to discuss. And he said to me, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, but how can I have PCOS if I'm not fat and hairy? Which I stress, his words, not mine. And essentially what he said was that there is the typical phenotype with PCOS, which is associated with insulin resistance and obesity and often hirsutism. He said lean PCOS is actually very common, but very often not diagnosed because it doesn't exhibit the symptoms of classic PCOS. And then when I actually came to see a gynecologist for fertility, he said, yeah, lean PCOS is actually a lot harder to treat from a fertility point of view. He said, because classic PCOS actually very often lose weight, change your diet, very often that can restore ovulation, and that's much easier to treat. He said, yes, lean PCOS is still an endocrine disorder. It's still associated with insulin and that you're sensitive rather than resistant. But it's a lot harder because you can't just, and there is no just about it, because, when you're fighting against insulin resistance, trying to lose weight is hideous. But he said it's a lot harder to treat. And then when it actually comes on to fertility treatment, Clomid, which is an ovulation induction drug, it's just a simple tablet and it helps to try and kick your ovaries into gear. He said very often women with classic PCOS will often respond very well, very easy to treat. He said women with lean PCOS are often Clomid resistant, and it's often they're more likely to not respond to that. So he said actually very often it's the women with lean PCOS. If women end up having IVF due to PCOS, it's very often women with lean PCOS, because they're often, not again, statistics doesn't, but they are more likely to not respond to the simpler treatments. So again, it's this misconception that there's only one type of PCOS. So that's, and they said, look, you've got loads of eggs. There's, from an egg reserve point of view, there's no kind of major issues there. So, but because we knew that I had PCOS, essentially it was, well, the warehouse is fully stocked, but the merchandise doesn't ship. So we expected that I would need some kind of help to help with ovulation induction. So what that meant was I actually went to see a private gynecologist. I actually went to see him because I got diagnosed with epilepsy not long after we got married, and so I wanted to understand, they call it preconception counselling, what would the pathway be, because obviously the NHS won't see you for anything fertility related until you've been trying for a year, or 6 months if you're over 35. But as we knew, I could have gone 10 months without a period. It was like, okay, well, let's try and find, if you're not even in the game. And then things kind of went catastrophically wrong with my ovaries in various different ways, which we can happily come on and talk about. But I am not a typical story. In terms of fertility, my gynecologist fertility consultant said, and he's an expert in PCOS, like he's written textbooks, and he said, I'm stumped, and I'm not usually stumped. Doctors, and actually it turns out that the reason I can't have children is actually nothing to do with my eggs. It's to do with my womb lining and my periods. So it's to do with the bleeding rather than the eggs. Various things happened with kind of my PCOS disappearing and then coming back, which again, no one has an answer for, but it turns out that the reason that I can't get or stay pregnant is actually to do with my womb lining. So that's the reason I really wish I had paid more attention to my cycles when I was younger. My periods were problematic in the sense that they didn't happen very often, but we thought we had an answer for that because I had PCOS. Okay, fine, that's an explanation. What happened when I came off the pill because we wanted to start to try, and we'd expected to have issues to do with my ovulation. It turned out, I won't even go to the egg saga because it's long, boring and very complicated, but essentially what transpired to be the problem is that my womb lining wouldn't grow, and more importantly, it wouldn't shed. So even when we did manage to get it to grow, obviously what a period is your womb lining breaking down and shedding as a menstrual bleed. And obviously the menstrual cycle is the first half of the cycle is your womb lining getting really juicy and getting, to a nice big snuggly mattress for an embryo to snuggle into. And then if you don't get pregnant, then it's the womb going, right, let's clean out, refresh, let's reset. So it's, it's cleansing, etc. Mine wouldn't do that. And it never did this before. So we don't know what happened between, when age 28 or, any time before that to then when I came off the pill at 33. And all throughout when I'd been on the pill, I'd had normal, light bleeds, but they were red bleeding. Then when I came off the pill, essentially that just stopped. I had brown spotting. There was no red bleeding. It was, I didn't need a tampon, didn't even need a pad. And I've seen one of the world experts in womb lining. There's a guy in Coventry who's a professor. Most of the literature that's been written on the role of womb lining in implantation and miscarriage has been written by this dude. It's at the Tommy's National Miscarriage Research Centre in Coventry. And, he's Professor Womb Lining. And he said to me when I went to see him, and this was kind of at the end of our fertility journey where we tried all sorts of experimental treatments. And he said, Miss Lindemann, he said, you are without doubt the weirdest case I have ever seen. He said, most people that come through my door are medically boring, but you are anything but that. I have never seen what happens in your womb in humans, only in mice. And then I had these womb biopsies that they do for these tests, and that kind of I wasn't going there to have these tests because actually the problem was I couldn't get to an embryo transfer because my lining just wouldn't grow, and I'd had various surgeries, and again we can touch on that. But essentially even when they did these womb biopsies, which aren't very pleasant, but essentially they kind of go in with the equivalent of a hole punch into your uterus and kind of essentially do a punch biopsy to get a sample of your womb lining. They did, I think, out of 4 different punch samples, there literally wasn't any usable tissue for the lab to even look at. Like, it was just gunk. There wasn't womb lining there. I've spoken to doctors on both sides of the Atlantic. No one has a clue. Like, they've never seen this before. So I am not typical, but essentially we spent a couple of years over between IVF just trying to get me to have a period, trying to get me to have a bleed. And it was really upsetting and actually after our first miscarriage, we still, we couldn't get me to have a bleed. I had surgery, but we still couldn't get me to have, I'd had 2 surgeries, but we still couldn't get me to have a bleed. Like, we could get my lining to grow, and we did some egg collection, but then it's still, so even when we got my lining to grow, and you could see there was this, quite a juicy looking lining on ultrasound, I was like, well, where does it go? So all I got was this kind of black gunk. I was like, and we could see that it had thinned on the ultrasound. I was like, how do we go from 11 millimeters to 3 millimeters without having had a bleed? So whatever happened, it sort of reabsorbed and compacted. And it was just so upsetting because, it's supposed to be cleansing and regeneration. And we knew from my surgery that I still had pregnancy tissue in there. And so I just felt like my womb was this like toxic place where, my baby had died. It was a miscarriage. And so just not being able to see that healthy red bleeding, and I still don't have that. It's it's really upsetting. And so again, I wish I had been more aware. And I know that there wasn't anything weird or normal when I was younger, but it's a very strange feeling, particularly when you're going through fertility and infertility, that most of the time you're supposed to desperately hoping you won't get a period when you're trying for a baby, and you're desperately hoping when you're pregnant, if you're pregnant, not to bleed. And so you kind of have knicker watch where you're constantly checking to see if you're bleeding. And mine was the reverse for most of my fertility treatment. We were just desperately trying to get me to have a period, as in to have a bleed. So I am not the typical, and none of this we think is to do with my PCOS. That's the thing, is that, or we don't know, but there is no reason that what happened with my womb and my periods, as in my bleeds, is necessarily anything to do with PCOS, because there's, PCOS is a very common endocrine disorder. And so I am not typical.
What would you have done differently if you could go back? And I know it's easy to play the shoulda, woulda, coulda game, yeah. But just, with all of the knowledge and all of the experts that you've spoken to, if you had a time machine, and I know you used the time machine analogy before, what exactly would you have done differently?
I would definitely have, be aware of your cycles, be aware of your body. I would probably have, again, knowing what I know now, said, get a copper coil, so non-hormonal contraception. And then if you're really, if there was a holiday or exams or something, knowing what I know now, then you can delay your period or take it to make sure that you don't get a period for those important times. And I would not go on hormonal contraception. I would have got a copper coil and tracked my periods and been aware of my fertile signs. And again, it was a clue when I came off the pill and started, I bought Taking Charge of Your Fertility and started charting and following your cervical fluid. And again, it was all of this stuff that with ovulation sticks, that I thought that wasn't something quite right, because you're supposed to get cervical fluid that is an indication of estrogen. And I wasn't getting that. And so I was like, what's going on with my estrogen? I'm not getting these proper periods. And I was convinced from the start there was something wrong with my lining. And it turned out that was right. But again, it's putting the pieces of the puzzle. So I would say, with my time machine, track your cycles. And I would not have gone on hormonal contraception, but I would have been aware that it is still possible to use hormone, if there's something important or a holiday, that, a short period of time that you can control your menstruation in that way. So yeah, that's what if my time machine I would have done.
Has your experience changed your view on hormonal contraception?
I think for me personally, yes, because my issues are so strange. What I would again say, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And again, I think, the Mirena is a wonderful thing, and particularly for women that have heavy periods or endometriosis, because again, in my writing and the stuff that I do now with fertility, and my consultant was an endometriosis surgeon. He wrote the textbooks, and endometriosis and fibroids are debilitating. And so for many women, using hormonal contraception can be life-changing. So I'm not kind of anti-hormones. What I would say is, to anyone who's thinking about getting pregnant, come off, if you are on hormonal contraception, come off well before you want to start trying. And particularly if you are, if you've got the Depo-Provera, because that particularly, it can take up to a year. That's a lot longer, the washout time. So I would say to anybody, if you want to, if you're thinking about wanting to start trying, come off hormonal contraception well before you want to start trying, and track your cycles.
What would you say is your feeling towards your period now?
It's it's a horrific reminder